me then begin. So yesterday we studied monodromy around a small loop. Okay, and let me write down the result again. So we took a small loop of circumference of order epsilon. We started at some point x naught with some tangent vector which we call n naught, and then you went around this loop and you found what becomes of this tangent vector under parallel transpose around this loop by the time you have come back to the original point. And we did this calculation to order epsilon square. Okay, so at present we cannot say anything about what happens at order epsilon cube or half. Okay, but at least to order epsilon square you know the result. And the result was the following. So Ni of epsilon was given by Ni naught, this is the original vector, minus half R in x naught in naught, and then you had an integral. Okay, I wrote it as a closed integral. So this symbol will denote the fact that it's a closed loop. Okay, not a complex contour integral, because there is a complex number over here. And then we had xl of u minus xl naught ddu of x cube of u minus x naught. And then there are corrections of order epsilon cube about which we do not know anything as of now. So before I go on, let's try to find an interpretation of this term over here. Okay, what does this term represent? It is some property of the curve. Okay, it doesn't depend on the choice of the tangent vector, but it is some property of the curve. So let's try to evaluate this for a spatial curve. So the spatial curve that we will take is a rectangle lying in the x1, x2 plane. Okay, and then of course we can take replace that by rectangle in any xi xj plane. But for now, let's take the curve to be a rectangle in the x1, x2 plane. So we have x1, x2. So this point is the point x naught. So this point in the x1, x2 plane will correspond to x naught 1, x2. Okay, the other coordinates are not being displayed here. Okay, there are of course all other coordinates which have to be taken into account. And we consider a rectangle which goes along the x1 axis, then goes vertically up along the x2 axis, then goes back and comes down. So this is the curve that will be considered. And we will take the sides of the rectangle to be A and B. So this, now we are talking about only coordinate distances. Okay, so this A essentially means that x1 changes by A. Okay, not that the physical size is A. Okay, because physical size you have to also put in the metric. Okay, right now we just think of this as x1 changing by A, because after all this expression over here doesn't contain any metric. Okay, just take x1 going from x1 naught to x1 naught plus A, and then x2 going up.
Both A and B are of order epsilon.
Yeah, both A and B are of order epsilon. A, B of order epsilon. And just to fix normalization completely, I can take this point as u equal to 0. Okay, we start from u equal to 0, and then we just take u, divide the u length equally among these 4 segments. So this will be u equal to epsilon by 4. This this will be u equal to epsilon by 2. This is u equal to 3 epsilon by 4. Okay, and by the time it has come back here, it has become e equal to epsilon.
But for each segment, the path will not be equal.
So
Yeah, it will not be equal.
It's not an FN parameter.
Pardon?
It's not an FN parameter.
Yeah, see, this is not even a geodesy. So, no question of it being an affine parameter. Right? We are not asking that. It's some parameterization that we are asking. Because parallel transport equation is valid for arbitrary parameters. Right? So, you have never assumed that U has anything to do with affine parameter. So, you have to evaluate this expression over this plane. Is this clear? Now, one thing is clear, that if we consider xi minus xi naught, okay, for any point on this curve, this is 0 for I not equal to 1 or 2. Right? Because it's in the plane x1, x2 plane. So all the other coordinates are sitting at their original values. Right? That's what we mean by you are moving in the x1, x2 plane. Okay? x3, for example, is x3 not all through this curve. Okay? x4 is equal to x4 not all through this curve. So these are all 0, which means that this integral, okay, that we have vanishes unless both L and K are 1 or 2. If any of them is 3, for example, right? Suppose L is equal to 3, okay, doesn't matter what K is, then x3 of u minus x3 naught is identically 0 all along the curve. Okay, so it will automatically vanish. So only for L and K equal to 1 or 2, this is non-zero. We have also seen that it's antisymmetric.
So
Right?
they cannot be equal.
So only 1, 2 and 2, 1 are the only possible choices, and they are opposite of each other because of antisymmetry. Right? So you can take 1, 2 and or 2, 2, 1. So let's evaluate this for L equal to 2, K equal to 1. Let's see, that's what I have done. Or take L equal to 1, K equal to 2. So take L equal to 1, K equal to 2.
So, yesterday when we did this equation,
Yes.
we had the written in an antisymmetric form that x l dxk and minus xk dxl, and that's why the half came. So if you are keeping the half, should we keep both the?
No, the half came because we only got half of R. If you look at the expression for Rijkl has 4 terms, right? We got only 2 of the 4 terms. See, this is automatically antisymmetric, right? So you could write it as antisymmetric, but it's not necessary, it's automatically antisymmetric. But whatever was multiplying it was not automatically antisymmetric, it was only half of the contribution to R. And then he added the other one with minus sign, that's why this half came. Is this okay? So this is the correct normalization that we have. So, are there any questions? So let's be completely explicit. So what I am going to do now is that I will write down the x1 and x2 coordinates, okay, for all points on these 4 segments. Okay, so let's call this segment 1, segment 2, segment 3, segment 4, and we will write down the x1, x2 coordinates of on all 4 segments. So let's start with segment 1. So what is x1 as a function of u on segment 1? So it starts from x1 naught. It starts from here and goes up to x1 naught plus a, right? Because x1 naught is changing by a. So we basically assume that it grows linearly. Okay, that's the simplest possibility. So you take these to be plus a. Now you have to multiply by u. Because u is the one which is growing.
4a by epsilon.
Times. So
4
4
by
here I
epsilon.
have already written, so 4 over epsilon.
Yes.
Because by the time you goes to epsilon over 4, this must go to x naught plus a. Is this clear?
Yes.
x2 of u, how much is this?
This is too much.
This is x2 naught. Is this okay? So how much will this integral?
0.
It will be 0. Why will it be 0?
Because k is 2 and 2 is a
Because
constant.
k is 2, right? And ddu of this is 0, right? x2 is keeping fixed, so integral is equal to 0. Let's look at segment 2. So on segment 2, x1 remains fixed. It's going up.
Hmm.
x1 remains fixed at x1 naught plus a. x2 increases, right?
Hmm.
It goes from x2 naught
Hmm.
plus b, it has to increase by b.
4b by epsilon times c.
2 by epsilon.
No.
2 by epsilon? No, I think
No.
it should be
4b
see.
by epsilon.
Okay. First of all, it should be u minus epsilon by 2. Okay. Because at u, sorry, epsilon by 4. Because at u equal to epsilon by 4, that's this is still 0.
Yes.
Okay. U now goes up from epsilon by 4 to epsilon by 2.
Yes. 4b by epsilon times 0.
Hence 4 over epsilon.
So 2 over.
2 over epsilon?
No, 4 over
No, 4
epsilon.
over epsilon. Because this changes when u is equal to epsilon by 2, this becomes epsilon by 4, right? This difference. So epsilon by 4 has to be cancelled by 4 over epsilon because it has to go, by the time u goes to epsilon over 2, this must go to x naught plus b, x2 naught plus b. So integral, how much is the integral from here?
X naught
A times
a times ab 4ab by epsilon.
So AB ddu gives you 4b over epsilon.
4ab
So
over
4 over epsilon, b I have already included, 4 over epsilon.
Hmm.
And the u integral ranges over epsilon by 4.
So
So
epsilon by
times
4.
epsilon by 4. So this is AB. Is clear? On segment 3, x2 is equal to x2 naught.
x2 naught plus b.
Yeah, x1 you can write, sorry, x2 naught plus b.
So 0.
Okay, x1 is changing, it's coming back. But if you look at this, k is 2, ddu of x2 minus x2 naught is what you have to evaluate, right? So it doesn't matter what is happening here, this makes it 0. Yeah, because x2 is fixed, so integral is 0. Segment 4, x1, what is the value of x1 on segment 4?
x1 0.
x1 is x1 0 because it has come back to the same vertically above x1 0, right? So x1 is equal to x1 0.
0.
Okay, x2 is doing something, but it doesn't matter what it's doing
Because it's 0.
because L is 1, so x1 minus x1 0 is 0. So integral is 0. Which basically means that this integral, okay, the whole integral becomes AB. So net integral So that's the area of this loop. Is this clear? So I can write this for this particular case that, okay, I should first, let's convert this to a monodromy matrix. So given this, let's write a monodromy matrix, because we know that Ni of epsilon should have been equal to m I, let's rewrite the arguments, m x naught c I j m naught j. Okay, so let's compare these two to write down the monodromy matrix. So m, this is c is this part. So m x naught c I j. What can you say about this matrix?
Delta ij first term.
This is delta ij and minus this whole thing, half r I j a n x naught n j naught.
So in J naught will be there.
Agent.
N j naught is not here.
Below.
Just the integral.
Just this integral. And now what we see is that this integral is 0 unless KL is 1 2 or 2 1. It's equal to AB if, what did you choose? K equal to 1, L equal to 2? K equal to 1,
K equal to 2, L equal to
K equal to 2, L equal to 1, and minus AB if K equal to 1, L equal to 2. So instead of getting a sum, you basically get only one term, Rij 1 2. Okay, Rij 2 1 is the same as Rij 1 2. Right? It's Rij 1 2 multiplied by the area. Okay? And it's clear that if instead of taking this in the 1 2 plane, if I had taken it to be in the 2 3 plane, right, all would have happened is that this k would have been replaced by 2 3. And pick up any of these terms that you like. Okay, just pick your favorite values of k and l. Okay, take a rectangle in that plane, okay, and you get back that corresponding value.
So for an arbitrary path.
For an arbitrary path, if it's big, okay, then of course we'll see what happens. If it's small, you can still show that this is area. Okay, if it's planar, okay, it's still the area. Okay, in that plane, right? I mean, and it will take value only for when k and n lie in that plane.
Sir, area should depend on something like metric, right? This is what you are just multiplying a coordinate.
Yes, this is the area in the coordinates system, right? So not in the metric. So this is not a physical area, right? You are right, because to get to the physical area, you have to multiply by square root of determinant g. That you are not doing here. Okay? So these are the area in the coordinates, measured in the coordinates.
So it's just the multiplication of coordinates.
Exactly. It's just a multiplication of coordinates. Okay, but it's not very important that it's the area. Okay, what is important is that by choosing this rectangle appropriately, we can make only one of these terms non-zero. Okay, so that there is no possibility of cancellation between different terms in the sum. Okay, there is only one term which will be non-zero, so it's either if it's 0, then the term itself has to vanish. Okay, if it's not 0, then of course it's not 0. But you cannot complain that you have a sum of two terms, so maybe individually they are not 0, but the sum is 0, right? So that we can avoid by choosing these kinds of loops. Okay, but let's see what you want to use it for. Okay. So we'll use it for proving the relation that we mentioned yesterday. Okay, in one direction. Okay, and which is the following. Okay. Then suppose somebody told you that you have a Riemannian space, okay, and in that space the monodromy around any closed curve is identity. Okay, suppose somebody gives you this information. What this analysis shows is that as a consequence of that, the Riemann tensor must vanish identically. Is this clear how it works? Imagine that for any curve that you choose, okay, somebody has told you that the monodromy is identity. Now you choose a curve in the 1-2 plane, like this. So the monodromy is identity around this curve. On the other hand, we calculate the monodromy, right? This identity plus some one single term, Rij12. Okay, so Rij12 must vanish because the monodromy is identity. And then you repeat it for taking this in different planes. Okay, and this way you can prove that Rijkl is 0 identically in such space.
But you have order epsilon cube term.
Yes, but you can take epsilon to be sufficiently small, so that order epsilon cube can never cancel this. So if the monodromy is 0, is identity, then you know that this has to vanish. What are the additional conditions? We will see. Okay? But at least Rijkl has to vanish. Right? If the monodromy is identity. Because order epsilon cube cannot cancel order epsilon square. Right? You can take epsilon to be as small as you like. It's up to you. So unless Rijk equal to 0, the monodromy cannot be identity. Is that clear? Right? That we have not calculated this completely. Right? But epsilon is some parameter that is completely up to us. We can take this rectangle to be as small as we like. By taking it to be sufficiently small, we can ensure that if Rij had not been 0, this term will always dominate over this term and we will give a non-zero answer. Okay, simply by taking epsilon to be as small as we like. So no non-zero Rijkl is consistent with the statement that the monodromy must be identity around any closed loop. Is this okay? The other way clearly is not clear at this stage. At least we have not proven the other way. That if Rijkl is 0, right, then all you can say is that for a loop that is sufficiently small, the monodromy is identity up to order epsilon cube terms. Right? But you have not proved that it means that the monodromy is identity. Okay? So that's something we are going to try to prove now. But it will require some additional assumption, as we will see. So is this okay so far? Right, what we have proven? Now we want to see to what extent we can prove the other way. Namely, suppose somebody has given you that Rijk is 0. Can we prove that the monodromy around any closed curve is identity? Okay, this is our goal. Okay. But to do this, we have to derive a few additional relations, okay, which are straightforward, but you have to do it anyway. Some additional results. So let's consider some closed curve. Okay, not small necessarily. And let's take 2 points, x1 and x2 on this one. So let's call this segment C1, this segment C2. Now, what we will study first is the following question, that imagine that take this card and we can calculate the monodromy by starting at x1 and going around this card. We can also calculate the monodromy by starting around x2 and going along the same curve. Right? The curve is the whole circle, the complete curve, but we can start at any point on this curve and go around the loop. The question is, what is the relationship between the monodromies that you calculate this way? Okay, does it depend on the origin or is it independent of the origin? So, in one case you are calculating, let's say mx1, x1, and then you go like c1 plus c2. No, see with the arrow, I have drawn the arrow in this direction. Okay, so c2 by definition is this direction. Versus m x2 c2 plus c1. Okay, we want to compare this. Pardon?
The question that you had understood.
What is the relationship between these two? Okay, are these the same? Okay, or are they related in any way? That's the question you have to ask. Is this clear? Now, this can be derived easily from whatever you had seen earlier. So, this quantity I can write as a product of two terms. That first we go from here to here, and then we go from here to here. Yeah. The total monodromy is the combination of these two transformations. So, this I can write as m x1 c1 x m
x1
x1 x2 m x2 x1 c2. This one is the same product but written in the opposite direction. M x1 x2 c1 plus m x2 x1 c2. Is this okay?
Since the matrix they do not necessarily.
Yeah. So since these are matrices, they don't necessarily compute. Right? So in general, they are not equal. Okay. Nevertheless, I will try to write this in a way which will be useful. I will write this as m x2 x1 c2 m x2 x2 c2 plus c1 and then m x2 x1 So what did we do? I took this out first. Then this one, okay, we are just left to the x1, x2, c1. I multiplied by this matrix to make it into this, and then multiplied by its inverse. Because this product m x2, x2, c2 plus c1 times m x2, x1, c2 inverse basically removes this and gives us back this matrix. Okay, that's exactly what we have here. Is this clear? This one, okay. So you understand this is equal to this, and this is equal to this. Okay. So now I have this product. Okay. So the first term is exactly what we have here. The second term mx2x. Okay. This product. Okay. This term here, okay, I wrote as mx2 x2 c2 plus c1 times the inverse of this. You see the mx2 x2 c2 plus c1 times this inverse is exactly mx1 x2 c1, right, which is what we have here. So this combination over here, the claim is that these two are equal. Right, mx1 x2 c1 is just that when you have taken this equality, these two are equal, and multiplied by the inverse of this from the right. So mx1 x2 c1 become mx2 x2 c2 plus c1 times the inverse of this. Is this clear? Then it's just matrix algebra, right? I mean, if I have a matrix A equal to A times B, okay, I can write A as M times B inverse. And that's all I've done here. So these are the two matrices you want to relate.
We can multiply the mx2 x1 c2 from matrix of both.
From to this.
To both of them, so we'll get mx1 x1 c1 plus c2 times mx2 x1 c2. That will be mx2 x1 c2 into mx2 x2 c2 plus 1.
Yeah, but this will eventually not help. I mean, it will not be equal to this. Yeah, there will always be something left over. Right? So this is the way we want to use it. I mean, it's clear that these two are not the same. Okay, because whatever you do, you basically have two matrix products in the opposite order, right? They are not in general the same. Right? And you want to manipulate it in a certain way, and we wrote it in this fashion, right? But you can of course write it in various other ways also. The important point is that even though they are not equal, they are related by what is called conjugation. Okay? Do you know when you say two matrices are related by conjugation? A and B are conjugate. Conjugate if A equal to S B S inverse for some S. Okay, and that's what you see here. This matrix is, this is our S times the other matrix times S inverse. So this has one advantage, which is that even though A and B are not equal in general, if B is identity, then A is identity. Right? So while the actual monodromy associated with the closed loop, okay, depends on the initial point. Whether the monodromy is identity or not doesn't depend on the initial point. If it's identity around one, with one initial point, it will be identity with all other initial points. Is this clear? Yeah. So this means that if B is identity, then A is identity, and vice versa. If A is identity, you can multiply by S inverse and S, and B is identity. Right? So what this is saying is that even though the monodromy around the loop depends on the starting point, right? Because we saw that these are different in general. But if the monodromy is identity with one starting point, it will be identity around with all starting points. Okay? So if you are asking the question that whether the monodromy around a closed loop is identity or not, we can answer it with any initial point that we like. Okay, if the answer is yes, then it is yes for all other initial points. Is this clear? But we are going to use it in a slightly stronger form. Okay, that given two matrices like this, let me erase this now. given two matrices like this, if B has the form of identity plus order epsilon, in fact this is some small number, then A, which is S B S inverse, is also of the form identity plus order epsilon. Because S B S inverse is after all S I S inverse plus S order epsilon from times S inverse. Right? And as long as S is a finite matrix, this makes it identity and this remains of order epsilon. So if B is close to identity, then so is A, and vice versa. Is this okay? Right? And this is important because eventually you are going to use it for the small loops, okay, where you know that the monodrome you have proved if Rijk is 0, then the monodrome is close to identity, but you have not proven that it's identity, right? Because the order epsilon cube term cannot show it 0, right? At least you haven't shown that it is 0. Okay, so you have that, for that reason it will be important to use this. Remember that this identity is also there. Okay, that B is identity plus order epsilon, then so is A. So now again let's consider a big loop. Okay, for which we have not proven anything so far. Okay, no vanishing result or anything. And now the idea will be that because we have already some results on for small loops, okay, that for Rij is equal to 0, for small loops we know that the monodrome is 1 plus order epsilon cube. Okay, you are going to try to use that, and the only way you can use it is to try to divide the big loop into small loops. Okay. So let's see what happens if you divide a big loop into two loops. Okay, imagine that you want to calculate the monodrome around this, and we now take 2 points, say x1 and x2. And draw some other curve, okay, from x1 to x2, so that the big loop becomes a combination of two smaller loops. So let's label some segments. So we want to, so suppose we call this C1, C2, C3, and then this, if we travel in this direction, that will be minus C3. So let's start by looking at M x1, x1, C1 plus C2. Okay, that's the big loop which you want to calculate. This I can write again as this followed by this. So M x1, x2, C1, and then M x2, x1, C2. Okay, you go this way, then go this way. Okay? But you have not, this doesn't divide this into smaller loops, right? You have not completed the loops. What you want to do is to write this in terms of small loops. So what you can do is that we go like this, then go down, come up again, okay, to cancel this part, and then go like this. So formally we can do this by inserting a
MM inverse.
inverse. Okay, so mx2, so let's write from the right hand side. Okay. So m x1 x2 c1 was here, right? Now we want to complete this by adding this c3. So m x2 x1 c3, m x2 x1 c3. Okay. But you have to cancel it by its inverse. Okay. So we put m x1 x2 minus c3. Okay, this product is just identity. Okay, because this is inverse of this. M x2 x1 x2 minus c3 is m x2 x1 c3 inverse. Okay, that's what we are using. And then we have m x2 x1 c2. This. So this we can now see that we can write this. So these two together, I can write as m x1 x1 c1 plus c3, and these two together I can write as m x1 x1 minus c3 plus c3. So now it's a product of two monodromy matrices around two smaller groups. Is this okay? Now we want to divide it further. Okay, the first one, this one, the left hand side, we want to divide into two parts, the right hand side, we want to divide into two parts. So, in whichever way we like. Somewhere here and here.
So the last line should be m x2 x.
No, because this, okay, see, one goes like this, it starts at x1, ends at x1. The next one begins at x1, goes like this and ends at x1. Right, so it's both starting at x1. And in fact, this is whenever you try to do this, right, in both, the starting point is common. But then, of course, as we said, that you can move the starting point by conjugation. Okay, you can take any of these and conjugate. Okay, if you want to write this mx1, so this gives you the loop starting here, but suppose you want to now move it here. Right? You can conjugate this. Yeah? This one you can write in terms of monodromy along the same loop, but with a starting point here by conjugating this matrix. So now we have divided it. Okay. So the monodromy around this loop, okay, starting from here, coming back, I can write as a product of two. One is like this, the other one is like this. This is the same thing repeated again. Okay. But remember that the starting point, okay, cannot be this one. Right? For doing this, the starting point has to be shifted here. Okay, because it's only if the monodromy starts from here, okay, that there is a nice interpretation of going like this and then like this.
So we are maintaining clockwise kind of.
Yeah, we'll always maintain clockwise kind of thing, but you could also do anti-clockwise, it doesn't matter, as long as you maintain the orientation. One will be like this, the other one will be going like this, this. So this means that this quantity over here, I can write as product of two smaller contributions, okay, together with a conjugation. Because the two smaller contributions will be for monodromy starting from here. Okay. But this of course has monodromy starting from x1, so you have to do a conjugation.
So if that point is x3, we have this mx3, x3.
Yeah,
The path.
exactly. So you have x3, x3, right? And this is also x3, x3.
But the whole thing comes.
So
to
then the whole thing you will write the instead of getting this, right, which is sorry, instead of getting this corresponds to this loop. Okay? But we are starting from here now. Right? If you want to express this as this and this, you have to start from here. Okay? So this loop we express as a product of these two. But then we know that the starting from here and going like this and starting from here and going like this are related by conjugation. So this you have to first write as a conjugate of the monodromy starting from here, and then that monodromy you can express in terms of products of two smaller ones. Is this clear? And then we keep doing this, okay, keep dividing, okay, and expressing the result in terms of monodromies involving smaller and smaller loops. Is this okay? So let's suppose that we have divided the original loop into n parts. Divide the original loop into n parts. So then, okay, unless you choose the surface to be very kinky, typically each of those parts, each part has area of order 1 over n. So the original area basically gets divided into smaller areas. Right? Originally the area was of order 1, right? Whatever it was, some constant area. And original loop had some constant area. By the time you have divided into n parts, each part has area of order 1 over n.
N equals
Yes.
n equal parts.
Well, it doesn't matter in almost more or less equal parts, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be exactly equal.
For very large.
N parts, which each of which has the same order of size, right? We don't keep this unchanged and keep dividing the rest of the thing. That way also you can get n parts, right? But then one of the loops will have big size.
That
That's not what you want to do. You want to make sure that all the segments have more or less similar size. Okay, so that each of them has area of order 1 over n. Yes.
I'm still confused about this last line.
This like?
Why not x2, x2? The question here.
Yeah. So you start from here. So what is the loop? You start from here, go like this, come down. That's the first loop. In the second loop, you have to start from here because you have to cancel this part, right?
So the thing is that you are coupling this n x2, x1, c2 and n x1, x2 minus c2, the line above, right?
Yes. Let's look at this. Yeah, exactly.
So,
So you have to remember that the right hand one always acts first. Here, for example, you first start from x1, go to x2. So yeah, the ordering has to be from right to left, right? That's why this always start at x1. So is this clear? Okay, that if you keep doing this, each loop eventually will have area of order 1 over n. And again, here it doesn't matter whether the area is actually physical area measured in the metric or the coordinate area that we had been discussing, because metric is of order 1, right? We are not assuming that metric is either very large or small. Metric is of order 1, so you just divide it into n parts, each part has area of order 1, or order 1 over n. So which means circumference of order 1 over root n. So then monodromy if R I j k l is 0 is identity plus order epsilon cube. Epsilon is like 1 over root n, so 1 over n to the 3 half. Is this clear? So now let's see what is the structure, right? At the end, you will get several matrices like product of matrices, okay, each of which has the form identity plus order 1 over root n. Okay, these are the monodromies. But in between the monodromies, there will be conjugations, right? Because just like here, right, we have to conjugate once in a while because these are the wrong starting point, right? We have to conjugate, right? So once in a while there will be some SS inverse inserted in between, okay? Some other S prime, S1, S2, S2 inverse inserted here, right? Or there may be another S4 inverse around the whole thing, okay? So this is the structure, okay? So for each of the loops you will get a monodromy of order identity plus order 1 over root n or 1 over n to the 3 half, okay? 1 to the 3 half, and then some conjugations in the middle. But the conjugations, okay, we can perform. Suppose you have an S1 and S1 inverse, right? That means you are basically conjugating each of the monodromies in between. If you have S1, S, then A1 to A and S inverse. This is the same as SA1, S inverse, SA2, S inverse, up to SA and S inverse, right? Because basically you cancel up all the intermediate S's. So you can basically remove the S's, okay, at the cost of conjugating the corresponding monodromies, okay, by the S's. But as we have seen, the conjugation does not change, it keeps I plus order 1 over n to the 3 half as I plus order 1 over n to the 3 half. Right? So the conjugation is not going to change this fact. It will change the explicit form of the matrix. Okay? So at the end then we can remove the S's and we have again a set of prime matrices which have all been conjugated. But each of them is of order identity plus order 1 over n to the 3 half. How many such matrices are there? N matrices. Okay. So you are taking the product of n matrices, each of which is of the form identity plus order 1 over n to the 3 half. Okay. So can you say what the final matrix will be? What order?
Identity plus order of 1 over n to the 3 half plus order of 1 to the.
So it's like if you have, let's look at numbers. Okay, suppose instead of the matrices you have just numbers, okay, but it's the same. Suppose you have 1 over x1, 1 plus x2, up to 1 plus xn. Right? These x1, x2, xn are all small numbers. Each xi is of order 1 over n to the 3 half.
So 1 over n to the half will be then.
Yeah, so there are n things like this. After you have taken the product, this product is of order 1 plus 1 over n to the half, order 1 over n to the half. Is this clear? See, the way to see this is that you can do a binomial expansion, right? So the first term will be 1 plus x1 plus x2 plus xn. That's the first order term. Then there will be x1, x2 plus x2, x3, etc. Right? And if you do this counting, you will find that the product will have this will be of the form 1 plus 1 over n to the half. Okay, by taking the product of matrices of this kind, you will not gain by in the number more than 1 over n to the half. So basically, the point you are gaining because you have a lot of matrices, but that gain is compensated more than enough by the fact that each entry is very small. Right? If it was order 1 over n instead of 1 over n to the 3 half, then this product is not necessarily close to I1. Right? Because then n factors, each of which has order 1 over n, could add up to give something of order 1. Right? And then the binomial expansion is not valid anymore. Right? You really have to look at all the higher order terms. That's why we needed to use this. If Rij was not 0, right, then this would have been 1 over n instead of 1 over n to the 3 half. Because 1 over it would have been this is an order epsilon square contribution, right? order epsilon square contribution is 1 over n here. So that this argument then wouldn't hold here. It's only if Rij k is 0, okay, that we can do this. Take the product and conclude that the product is still I plus order 1 over n to the half.
So these X matrices were the conjugated version.
Yes, so each of these are the conjugated versions, exactly, the prime matrices, right? But there are these conjugations, right? But after conjugation it becomes prime matrices, but each of them are still 1 plus order 1 over n to the 3. And now we use the fact that n is completely up to us. Right? We can choose n to be anything that we like. So in particular, we can take the limit when n goes to infinity, and in that limit we say that this really is identity. Okay, now of course the result shouldn't depend on how you have what limit you have taken, right? If it is identity, it's identity, right? Because after all, we are calculating the monodromy around all the original loops, right? So that's a fixed number. Okay, we have just used this argument to show that it will be identity. Okay. But that basically means that if Rij k is 0, then the monodromy around the loop is indeed identity. But this of course has hidden assumption. Okay, and the hidden assumption is that there is a surface, okay, that you can draw which binds this curve, right? Because we are dividing this surface into smaller surfaces, right, by drawing curves on the surface. But imagine that there is a singularity here, right? Then you couldn't apply this argument, right? Because then if there is a singularity, then even a small loop around a singularity can have monodromy of order 1. Okay, that's what happens, for example, in this conical defect. Okay, that you can, if you have a conical defect like this, okay, then if you take any closed curve over here, right, you cannot draw a surface without including a defect, right? And once you have included the defect, then even a very very small loop, okay, can have a monodromy of order 1. Okay, because the argument that we used assumed that the metric is smooth. So you have to make sure that it is first of all possible to draw a surface, okay, which means that this curve must be contractible. Okay, and that basically means the manifold has to be simply connected, because otherwise you can always draw curves which are not contractible, and also that the manifold shouldn't have a singularity.
So the loop has to be a planar loop.
No, it doesn't have to be planar. That's not necessary. Right? This surface can be curved. Right? This argument still goes through. Right? Because the area, we don't want to make this surface area very very large, right? Because I mean we are assuming that whatever it is some fixed area surface you draw once in the beginning, right? And then you keep dividing that surface into smaller and smaller surfaces, right? By drawing curves on the surface. It doesn't have to be planar, right? But just pick some surface through this curve. And I have no idea really assume that it's planar.
So what the problem will come if I put a hole in between the units? Then in the proof, what problem will come?
Because then you keep dividing, right? But then, I mean, you can, I mean this, so you still are left with the monodromy along this curve, right? And you don't know whether this.
Okay, so because the whole meaning is that you don't know what is the integral. If I say that integral over this thing, if you do a loop over this thing is an identity. Then
Yeah, then of course you are safe.
Okay.
Right? But the whole basically means that you cannot use the vanishing of the Riemann tensor to argue that this is identity. Yeah, that is some extra information that we have to specify. Is this okay?
Sir, instead of define my curve C3 along this way, but even if I started from x1, we could have gone to that x3 point, then go to the joining point, then come back and
Yeah, but that's effectively conjugating by this line. If you look at what is happening, so you are saying you start from x1, go like this, then go like this, and then eventually come back. Yeah, so basically that is exactly what we did initially, that you are moving from, this whole process is like moving from here to here. When we showed that it's related by conjugation, okay? Basically we related monodromy around this to monodromy around this. Okay? So yes, you could go like this, then complete this cycle, then come back. Okay? But that will be effectively conjugation. Okay, so what I have described so far is completely general. So that is the general notion of parallel transport. Okay, and these results are also general, and this is really the way one should think of parallel transport on a general Riemannian manifold. But sometimes it's useful just to develop some intuition, to think of the manifold as being embedded in some Euclidean space, okay, and see what parallel transport means. This is not necessary for anything, okay, this is just to get some idea of what it physically corresponds to. But in general, right, it's not easy to find an embedding space, right? You may not be able to describe a Riemannian space, okay, as something embedded in some Euclidean space. Okay. So what I am going to describe now, okay, is very spatial, okay, but it's useful for developing some intuition. Okay. Typically what happens, if you have a very complicated Riemannian manifold and if you want to embed it, you have to embed it in a very high dimensional space. Okay, and then you already lose all your intuition anyway. So, but nevertheless, okay, let's see what parallel transport means in case if you describe a surface as an embedded surface. So let me first describe what we mean by embedded surface. So let's suppose that our Riemannian space is labeled by this coordinate xi with I running from 1 to n. So it's n-dimensional Riemannian manifold that you have to describe. Now suppose this n-dimensional manifold can be described by writing a set of equations in a higher dimensional flat space. Okay, just like a sphere, okay, the surface of a sphere you can write as x square plus y square plus z square equal to s square, right, in 3-dimensional Euclidean space. Let's suppose that something like this can be done. So then we say that this is embedded, suppose it's embedded in a flat space with coordinates y1 to yd. Okay, typically d is larger than n. So for the sphere, n is 2, okay, d is 3. Okay, when you write x square plus y square plus z square equal to s square. So a general way to think of these embedded spaces is by thinking of the y's as being given functions of x. So we write y alpha equal to f alpha of x for the set of functions f1 to f. Okay, so alpha is the variable that runs from 1 to b. Okay, so alpha, these Greek letters will denote the coordinates of the space in which you embed.
So the minimum d will be n plus 1.
Well, if the original space is flat, then the minimum d can be n. Right? Suppose you have a flat space, right? Then trivially it's embedded in flat space, so that way d can be n, but otherwise yes, it will be typically, if you have a Riemann, complicated Riemann surface, right, the D has to be very high. Okay, for each Riemann surface you can find, okay, what is the minimum dimension you need to embed it. Right? But for sphere, for example, if you have a two-dimensional sphere, it can be embedded in three-dimensional space. But suppose you have found such embedding, okay, and you have described this by specifying the y's as functions of x. Right? This is the way we can specify an embedded surface, right? Because what does this do? This tells us that given any point on the embedded surface on the Riemannian manifold, we have a representation of this in this big space. And every point on the Riemannian manifold can be described as a point in this big space. But of course, not all points on in the big space are part of the manifold, right? Because this only is a d-dimensional space, right? Because there are d parameters here. N dimensional space. There are n parameters here, and there are many more y alphas, right? So clearly, this you can also think of as giving some relationship between the y alphas. But this is the easiest way by which you can describe an embedded surface.
Or in other language, the space with the constraint.
Yeah, so that means that you have to write some equations for y's. Okay? This means that the y's are not all independent; they have satisfied some constraint.
So it's like in the case x3 was the function of x1 for sphere.
Yes, that's one way of doing it. So let's do this for the sphere, right? What is the easiest way to describe this?
So here we are assuming that relation between y's and x.
Yes.
Like if we use a sphere in three-dimensional space, we see that the original coordinates in three dimensions is x1, x2, x3.
Yes.
And we can use various coordinates for the sphere like theta phi or x1.
Exactly. Yeah.
But each of them can be because we can also shift the variables. Instead of taking x1, x2, we could have taken x2, x3.
Yes, you can do. So x's are some intrinsic coordinates. You can make a coordinate change, right? X, you know that there are general coordinate transformation on anyone else, right? X to x prime. So you can certainly make change of coordinates in x. Right? Why we don't want to make change of coordinate, at least not with general change of coordinate, because y are spatial coordinates in which the metric on the embedding space is just Euclidean. Say dy1 square plus dy2 square plus dy. Well, if this itself was a complicated metric, then it's not very useful, right? Okay, then this embedding doesn't solve too much for this. So, example. Is sphere, two-dimensional sphere. So here the x's we can take to be theta phi. Okay, these are the intrinsic coordinates that describe the sphere. And the embedding space is y1, y2, y3. So y1, y2 and y3 can be written as a cos theta, a sin theta cos phi, a sin theta sin phi, cos theta. Right, this is just one example of how you can describe a sphere. Okay, by specifying the coordinates in the embedding space in terms of the coordinates on the Riemann surface. This is of course also equivalent to say that we have y1 square plus y2 square plus y3 square equal to a square. So in this way of doing it, there is a simple way to now write down the metric on the Riemann surface that is of interest to us. Okay, if we can find an embedding of this kind, okay, then there is a simple way to write down the metric that is of interest to us. Namely, we just write dA square is sum over alpha dy alpha dy alpha. Okay, because we are saying that we are embedding in flat space, okay, and we are now taking flat Euclidean space. We could have replaced this by some Minkowski or other signature space, but let's take flat Euclidean space. So this was the metric in the embedding space, right? Because the embedding space by definition is flat. By we have said that we are embedding in flat space. Now to find the metric on the Riemannian manifold that's of interest to us, all you have to do is to use these equations to express dy in terms of dx. So this I can now write sum over alpha del f alpha del xi dxi and del f alpha del xj dxj. I can just rearrange it a little bit. Del f alpha del xi del f alpha del xj dxi. Okay, I could in fact even remove the summation over alpha because it's repeated anyway. Okay, but I have just chosen to write somehow alpha. So this quantity is now Gij of x.
You were making the choice that it's in Euclidean space.
Yes, you are making the choice that the embedding space is Euclidean. Right? You have assumed that you can embed the original Riemann surface or the Riemannian manifold in a Euclidean space.
So means this distance we are talking about,
Yes.
dy for the alpha, it is a distance on the Riemannian surface.
This is so you have this is the Riemannian space, right? Take two nearby points on this. So the metric on the Riemann this Riemannian manifold will measure the distance between these 2 points. But because it's embedded in a higher dimensional space, there is another notion of distance between these 2 points, right? Which is just the direct distance measured in the space in which you have embedded, right? Which is flat, which is this. Right? And the idea is that that notion of distance must agree with the notion of distance on the Riemannian manifold, at least when the points are sufficiently close. Okay. Of course, if one point is here and one point is here, right, then the distance on the Riemannian manifold has to be measured along the geodesy, connecting the two. Okay. Whereas the distance in the Euclidean space will be just this distance. Okay. But these are not equal. Okay. But when they are sufficiently close, okay, then to first order we expect that these distances, these notion of distances should be equal. Okay, but in fact that's what defines what we mean by metric on this Riemannian manifold. That for infinitesimal separation, the distance on the Riemannian manifold must agree with the distance in the original Euclidean space. And otherwise, you will not call it an embedding. Okay, it's an embedding only if the distance is induced from whatever the notion of distance was in the original Euclidean space. Is this clear? Now let's imagine that you have this embedding space, and suppose you have some curve on the embedding space, and on some point on the curve we pick a specific tangent vector in this on the Riemannian manifold. Okay, tangent vector. What is a tangent vector? A tangent vector basically labels all possible geodesics, right? This basically labels the tangents to the curve, because geodesics or any curve on the Riemannian manifold, of course, has to lie on the Riemannian manifold, right? It doesn't make sense for the curve to come out. So, a tangent vector is really what we normally think of as a tangent vector, right? It's a tangent to this surface. But unlike if it is a curve, okay, then the tangent is unique, right? If it is curved in 2 dimensions, then what you mean by tangent is just a unique vector. But imagine that you have a sphere in 3 dimensions. Then a tangent at a point is actually a plane, right? It's not a fixed vector. And a tangent vector is any vector in that plane. Okay, so that's the notion of a tangent vector, okay, when you think of it as an embedding space. So picking a tangent vector at this point basically means that you are taking some really tangent vector as a normal think of as tangent vector. Okay, some vector that is tangent to this surface, to this subspace. Okay, it can be any tangent. Okay, if it's if the manifold is n-dimensional, then it's an n-dimensional vector space. Right? The tangent space is an n-dimensional vector space. So we could take any vector in this n-dimensional vector space. Is this clear? Now you want to move to a neighboring point. And we had already introduced the notion of parallel transport. Okay, but now I am going to give a different notion of parallel transport, which will eventually show that agrees with the notion that we have already introduced. Okay, but this different notion will be based on the embedding space. So here is a tangent vector. Now we simply take the same vector and put it here in the embedding space. That makes perfect sense. Embedding space is flat, right? In flat space, you know how to move a vector parallel to itself. So it makes sense to take this and put it as a parallel vector in the embedding space.
So, but, sir,
Yes.
will it map to your tangent plane at that point of the curve?
Yeah. So it will not, in general, be in the tangent plane at that neighboring point, because the tangent plane keeps shifting, right? If the manifold is curved, then the tangent plane at this here is not the same as the tangent plane here. So in general, this vector will be out of the tangent plane, right? So this is not yet the parallel transport that we have defined, okay? But it's just some vector that we have obtained in the embedding space by parallelly moving this to the neighboring point. But now we project this vector along the tangent plane at this point. Okay, this is a well-defined operation. We will write down what it means by projecting. Okay. But it's that if we have a plane, right? If you have a vector in a d-dimensional space, and if you have a plane, there is a well-defined notion of what you mean by projecting onto the plane, right? Because it's after all Euclidean, right? Everything is Euclidean, so you remove the orthogonal component. Right? Given a plane, there are certain orthogonal directions, certain tangential direction. So you just subtract off the orthogonal component and keep the tangential component. Okay? So there is a well-defined operation which tells you that given a vector here, how to project it in the tangent plane.
But sir, when we have drawn the first point tangent vector,
Yes.
that dimension of the vector is not same with the dimension of the Riemannian manifold.
This is just one vector.
Yes,
It's
but
a one vector in the tangent plane.
yeah,
right?
but
But it's an n-dimensional vector. So this one, right?
yeah, but what I'm trying to ask is that as we are transporting it in the embedding space,
Yes.
dimension of the tangent space
Yes.
must be of the
True.
embedding space.
So you have to learn how to take. See, think of it physically. The dimension of the tangent space here is n-dimensional, not d-dimensional, right? Because there are n possible tangents. If you have a sphere in 3 dimensions, right? Draw a tangent at any point. What is the dimension of the tangent?
Yes, that I'm
2
understanding.
dimensional,
Yes,
right?
yes,
So
yes.
the tangent vector is lying in a 2-dimensional vector space. Okay? But now you have to learn how to make that 2-dimensional vector into a 3-dimensional vector, right? Physically, it's clear that it's possible, right? It's a 2-dimensional vector, but it's also a vector in 3 dimensions, right? Okay, so you have to just learn how to write down a mathematical formula which lets you do that.
Yes.
Okay? But physically, it's clear that it has a 2-dimensional vector to begin with, and you can regard this as a 3-dimensional vector because this is also a vector in the 3-dimensional space, right?
Yes.
Take a tangent vector to the sphere at any point, right? It's certainly a vector, a 3-dimensional vector, right? If the sphere is embedded in 3-dimensional space.
Yes, so the second point we are just putting the same vector at the second point.
Yes.
That is a tangent vector in the embedding space.
No, it's not a tangent vector as yet. When you just move this, it's just a vector in the embedding space. It's not tangent to anything. It was tangent here. Okay, you just
It is tangent to the Riemannian surface.
not yet. No,
No.
when you just move parallel.
Yes, yes. The old point, the first point,
Yes,
the vector we have drawn is a vector in the tangent space of the Riemannian surface.
that's right.
In the second point,
Yes.
as we are using the idea of parallel transport in the embedding flat space,
Yes,
that must be a vector of the tangent space, right? tangent space of the embedding.
That is the end. That is d-dimensional.
D-dimension.
Exactly. So this is d-dimensional vector. So you start with the two-dimensional a vector in the two-dimensional tangent space. Think of this as a three-dimensional vector.
And
Transport as a three-dimensional vector.
No.
But now you have to project it back into the two-dimensional tangent plane, which is tangent here.
Okay.
Okay. So that generates a tangent vector again at the neighboring point. Okay. So this we can define as the parallel transport of this vector. Simply regard this vector as a vector in three-dimensional, in a higher dimensional space, embedding space. Move it parallelly because the embedding space is just standard Euclidean flat space. Then project it in a tangent.
So when you project it, its normal will be reduced.
We'll see. It's not reduced because the point is if we have moved a little bit, right? It's like if the angle is theta. Okay. If you project, right? You pick up a component cos theta, right? Cos theta, when you expand, is 1 plus or the order theta term is 0.
Yeah.
Right? So for infinitesimal motion and infinitesimal projection, the norm is actually not reduced. Okay? The norm will reduce at higher order, but that we are only working to first order. Okay, so the norm is actually not reduced to this order.
So the projection is called the parallel transport.
Yeah, so this projection is called the parallel transport of this. Is this clear? Now, the question is, so this is a completely different notion of parallel transport to begin with, right? Okay, is it the same as the parallel notion of parallel transport that we had introduced, which didn't require any embedding? Right? There is a notion of parallel transport in the Euclidean space. Okay. And the answer is that indeed it is the same. Okay. So what I will do is to just outline the steps, okay, that you need to do, okay, to prove that it is the same. Okay, it's just a some algebraic manipulation. So let's imagine that these 2 points are lying on some curve, because you think of parallel transport in a curve, right? These 2 points are lying on some curve labeled by u. And M of u is the original tangent vector. Which is n dimension. Is this clear? This is the vector n of u. Okay, thought of as a n-dimensional vector. There is a vector in the tangent space of the Riemann vector. Now we want to regard this as a d-dimensional vector, m alpha. What is the relationship between m alpha and ni? Yes. Related by f. So what? Almost anything that you can guess is right. Because there is only one way to write things which has the right index. Right? You just guess something and it will probably turn out to be right.
df alpha by df
df alpha
by df
by del x by tan theta. Okay. So this is the lift of this vector. Okay, in the higher dimensions. Okay, the n capital, the d-dimensional vector, which represents this vector in the tangent space. So this is being evaluated at x of u. Now we move it as exactly the same vector at a new point. Okay. So we move it as same vector m alpha at x plus delta x, okay, which is the same as x of u plus delta u. So that's this operation. But now
X is a vector in embedding space.
X is not a vector, these are coordinates.
No.
These are the coordinates of the Riemannian space.
Okay.
Right? The Riemannian manifold. These are the analog of theta and phi.
Okay.
Okay, that which
Yes, but how we are relating to a higher dimensional M alpha to this?
here we have already done it. This is M alpha.
But this is a D dimensional.
No, this A alpha runs from 1 to n.
1 to D.
Or 1 to d. Exactly. Okay, 1 to d. Exactly. So this is M alpha is still a d dimensional vector.
Yes.
Right? That's this vector in the embedding space. Okay? Now we have to project it to the tangent space
Yes.
at this point, right? So what we are looking for is now ni of u plus d delta u. Now I have to write ni in terms of m alpha. Okay, but this time it's not the same vector because the same vector is out of the tangent space. Right? We are doing some additional operation of projection. So what is it in terms of m alpha?
Isn't that coordinate will be something y?
Which coordinate?
This x plus delta x.
No, because the new point is
But-
still on the Riemann surface.
Yeah, but the new point has a embedding space ambiguity.
Yes, no, new point has no embedding space ambiguity because y alpha is f alpha of x plus delta x. Right? This new point is a new point on the Riemann surface,
Okay.
on the Riemannian space, right?
Mm,
And this has a specific
yes.
coordinate representation in the embedding space.
That is with the constraint the point is.
Yeah, because this we are always
Yes.
moving on the surface,
Yes.
right? We are not moving away from the surface. So again, almost anything that you can write down is correct. Okay, so write down something.
So dxi
1 over del L.
Well, that is not correct because you see, del xi by del y alpha, right, is not defined because xi is not a function of y alpha.
Fine. It's just 1 by del F alpha del x.
But I mean, you cannot define 1 over something, right? So you have to be a little more innovative.
You have to subtract it. You have to first project it on the normal to the.
Yes, you can do it, but the one is much simpler. There is a simple expression that you can write down. I mean, basically, a factor like this only. Okay, but you have to be a little more innovative.
So why can't we invert the transformation at that
Just
point?
inverse. Del F alpha
Because
del
y
x I
alpha,
inverse.
there are n
More numbers.
variables, right?
Continuous not transformation. Del F alpha del x I inverse.
Well, del alpha of del x doesn't have any inverse because it's not a square matrix, right? So don't use inverse. Just put del alpha del xi. Okay? Because this looks like contracting two index upstairs, right?
no,
But
it's
the
a
metric in the
Euclidean
embedding
space.
space is flat Euclidean
Yes.
matrix, right? So contracting two index upstairs is okay.
Yes.
That's g alpha beta is just delta alpha beta. Okay, you can think of this as delta alpha beta if you don't like it. Times del f beta del x. Okay, but we are not done yet because
Xi
this
is-
index is below.
Hmm.
Okay, this is in the index is up.
Hmm.
So what should you do to
metric.
use a metric? So you put a gi j x j g I j. Okay, it's a little more complicated than the earlier one. Okay, and that is because the operation that we did earlier was in fact simple operation. We had a vector that was in the tangent space. We just didn't do anything to the vector. We just tried to regard this as some vector in the embedding space. Okay. Now we have a vector in the embedding space, but you have to do some operation. It's not the same vector that you are trying to represent in a tangent space, right? We have to make a projection. So because you have to make a projection, we needed to use a metric. But this is the correct form. Okay, and this now has to be evaluated at x plus x of u plus delta u. These are the new point, right? Because you have moved.
Sir,
Yes.
explain how this is physically defines the projection.
Yes, so if you use your usual intuition of Euclidean geometry, right? Because after all, this notion of projection is Euclidean geometry notion, right? you can prove this. You can prove that this is indeed the correct projection.
It's using that cos theta we can
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, just use the usual notion of Euclidean geometry to show that this is a projection. So now you can just expand this out. So I can write this as delta alpha beta m alpha. Well, let me just write it as m alpha. This should have been delta alpha beta m beta, but let's just write it as m alpha. Because this is m alpha. This I can write as del f alpha. This also x u plus f. Del f beta. Yeah, I think this should have been f alpha.
delta alpha beta.
Delta alpha beta m beta f alpha. That's okay. Yeah. So this is del alpha del xj at x, and then the second derivative del 2 f alpha del xj at delta xk. Okay, the change in x. Similarly, this one gij of x plus del l gij of x times delta xl. Is this okay? So let's just verify that the first term, okay, is really Ni of u. Okay, the first term is m alpha del f alpha del xj gi, all under x, right? But m alpha was given here. Nk del f alpha del xj gi. But del alpha del xk del alpha del xj is gkj. That was a metric, right?
So m alpha at x equals to x plus delta x.
Yes,
That is outside of the tangent plane.
exactly.
So how can we relate these that equation?
Because this m alpha is not part. This m alpha is indeed outside the tangent plane here.
Yes, yes.
Okay, but this is not. This is by definition in a tangent plane, right? Because this has only n components. So that's the projection. So this part is taking this vector m alpha and projecting it,
Yes, yes.
right? But this m alpha is the same as the original m alpha, which is not in the tangent plane,
Oh, yes.
right? Because that was the definition we used, right? We took the vector and simply moved it parallelly, right? So this one component by component is exactly the same vector.
Means their nk is nk at u. Means nk
Yes,
at
all of these are u, exactly. At u. And these are the okay. So this gives you nk gkj gij, right? That is nothing but ni, because this is delta ik, this gives you ni, right? So ni of u plus delta u, okay? If you don't move at all, this is really ni of u. Okay, that's at least one consistency check, that if you go from n to m and then come back by projection, you better get back the same, right? And indeed it does. So this is ni u plus stuff, right, which you can write as something of order delta u. And I'll leave as an exercise to check that from this you can get dni du gamma ijk k nj dx.
So then go to the frame where del I g Gij means del L Gij vanish. If it preserves the form that u plus del
Yes, you could, right? So you have to, but then that means you have to also adjust your x. Right? But this you can also prove directly, because see, f is related to the metric. Right? So all of these eventually you can relate to derivative of the metric, and you can get the gamma. Now it's clear at this stage that ni of u plus delta u, right? This is just gives you ni of u, right? And then the rest is of order delta u, right? Because the rest will come from the product of this term with this term and this term with this term. Okay, these two products of course already delta u square, right? Which you can ignore. And so you just have to manipulate this to show that f is related to g. Okay, so f is not independent of g. So using the relationship between f and g, you can show that indeed you get exactly this equation.
So this is the equation of the
Parallel transform. Exactly. So this equation we have derived without any embedding, right? Using a different notion of parallel transform, at least a priori different notion. This equation we got by using this new notion of parallel transform. Right? You go to the embedding space, move it parallelly and then project. And the idea is to check that these two notions are the same. That when you can embed the Riemannian manifold on to an embedding space, you can think of parallel transport as moving the vector in the embedding space, projecting, moving the vector again in the embedding space and projecting, and so on. But this of course has to be done at infinitesimal steps. Okay? If you move this vector, right, all the way here and then project, right, that's not going to be related by parallel transport to anything. Right? You move infinitesimally, project, and then again move infinitesimally and project, and so on. And that's what generates exactly the parallel transport equation that we had found earlier.
say if that m alpha moves along a geodesy,
Yes.
then these projections, the length will vary, but at least they will be parallel transport. The length will vary, but
Well, even if it moves along a geodesic,
then my every point the tangent space.
meaning if m alpha itself is a tangent vector, it is tangent to the curve.
Now I'm saying that m alpha, the way I'm taking my points,
Yes.
is say it is at that point and I'm finally at that point.
Yeah.
But say I'm moving along a geodesy.
You may be moving along a geodesic, but m alpha may be directed somewhere else, right? Because imagine that we are moving along a geodesic on the surface of the sphere, right? Like this. Okay, here m alpha is directed up here. So, or maybe here. Not along the geodesic, but some. Let's see. Yeah. The point if m alpha is directed in arbitrary direction, right? If it's tangent to the geodesic, then of course it always remains tangent to the geodesic. If it's in arbitrary direction, then parallel transporting by big amount, right, in the embedding space and then projecting is different than parallel transporting infinitesimally in general.
So if it's already tangent to the geodesy,
It will remain by definition, then it always remain tangent to the geodesic. Right? So even for keeping the norm fixed, right, it's necessary that you have to think of this as an infinitesimal motion at a time. Right? Because if you move this m alpha by a large amount, right, and then project, then the angle has become big, right? It's cos theta, but theta has become finite. Then if you project, the norm will change clearly, right? Okay, so from that point of view, also it's clear that it's only under infinite. If you think of this as the infinitesimal steps, that these two notions of parallel transport has translated. Another way of seeing the same thing is that if we make big steps, then parallel transport on a closed curve will always give identity. Right? You start from a vector here, go all the way along closed curve, okay, and you have not done anything, so the vector remains vector, the same vector, right? But obviously, if you do it in infinitesimal steps, we know that if the manifold is curved, right, the parallel transport is not going to bring it back to the same vector. Okay, so we'll stop there.